Welcome to this week's REI Weekly Lesson. My name is Greg Helbeck. I've been a full-time entrepreneur now for almost 10 years, and everything you're going to learn on this podcast/YouTube channel is real-world information from myself or from the guests. This is not regurgitated theory out of a book. So if you get value from this episode or any other episode you listen to or video you watch, do me a favor, subscribe to my YouTube channel, like the video, and if you're listening to this on Apple or Spotify, if you can do me a favor and share the show, it would really mean a lot to me. That's how we keep getting more downloads on a weekly basis. So today's topic is near and dear to my heart. It is screening tenants. How do you screen tenants? Because at least if you invest in a state like where I live, Washington or New York or California, where I used to live, it's difficult to do evictions, right? And you don't want to ever do evictions. But the best way to not do an eviction is to put someone into the property that is qualified and a good tenant. So today's going to be about how do you select the right tenant for your rental property? Because a lot of landlords, if you don't collect any rent, your ROI is horrendous. And I see a lot of people tell me, Greg, I can go buy this property for $30,000 and put in 20,000 and it'll rent for 700 a month. I'm like, yeah, that makes sense on paper, but the quality of tenant you're going to get in a neighborhood like that is going to be horrendous unless you're renting to Section 8, which is a different topic. So, how do you select a tenant for your rental property? So, before I do that, I just want to let you know my philosophy with rentals. And I personally would rather own fewer rentals in higher value areas versus a ton of trap houses in the ghetto, as they would say. Those properties, number one, aren't worth that much money, and the tenants that are in there usually can be problematic, to say the least, if you're in a war zone. But different strokes for different folks, as they say. So I like to own quality homes in areas where there's high growth, a good economy. So how do I select tenants? So the first thing I do is I look for the income, right? That's the most important thing. Can the tenant actually pay the rent? What is their income? If they're self-employed, I don't really care about that as long as they have the income to support, the amount of money they're stating they make. Usually, the rule of thumb with any landlord or any landlord book you read is they want to make 3 times the rent. So, for example, if your rent's 2 grand a month, the tenant in theory would want to make at least $6,000 a month. And the reason that is the case is if the tenant's bringing in 6 grand a month and their rent is 2 grand a month, they still have 2/3 of their income left over for other bills, right? But if the tenant is only bringing in 3 grand a month in income and the rent is $2,000 a month, there's really $1,000 left over after they pay you the rent. And they're going to have other bills, groceries, car payment, insurance, etc. So I like to see 3 times the rent. Do I get that every time? No. Sometimes I'll do 2.5, but at least 2 times the rent. And there's some other factors that I'm going to talk about that check the box. I might make an exception, but standard rule, 3 times the rent minimum. Second thing, credit score, right? This is a big deal. And a lot of people don't understand this. The only exceptions I will make to a credit score is if they had some sort of medical judgment that was out of their control. Let's say they blew their knee off or something, God forbid, and they had a medical bill that they had to pay for and that impacted their credit score. You can see that on a credit report, and I can make an exception to that because that was out of their control. It's a medical judgment. It's an unfortunate situation. So I could look past something like that, something out of their control, maybe a bankruptcy from like 10 years ago or something I could look past. But if I'm looking at someone's credit score and it's in the toilet and I can see on the credit report that they haven't paid their car payment, they haven't paid the child support, they haven't paid basic credit card minimums, I'm going to look at that credit score and I'm going to basically use that as a forecast on if they're not currently paying their bills and they have a low credit score, how are they supposed to pay their highest bill, which is usually their rent? So if the credit score is low, I'm going to start to look for other applicants if that's possible, because if they don't have a good credit score, pretty good chance they're probably not going to pay you rent. So you got to be careful with the credit score. That's the second thing. Third thing is references, right? You want to call not their previous landlord because that's like low hanging fruit. And if they're getting evicted or something, of course they're going to say, take them on because they don't want them. So like not their current landlord, their landlord before that, because at that point they're out of the picture. They've probably been out of the picture for a while and you can usually get the truth out of them. So let's say they're living in an apartment right now and they want to move into your house. I would call the landlord before they moved into their current apartment and say, hey, I just want to reach out to you to see how was your experience with them? What were they like as a tenant? That's all you want to say. You want to ask them open-ended questions. And if they're 2 properties removed, they're probably going to tell you the truth. Oh, they were a nightmare. Oh my God, I couldn't wait to get them out. I would never rent to them. Well, that would tell me good information as a landlord on there. Probably going to do the same thing with me. But if they're like, hey, they were great. They paid on time. They were awesome. And then I would ask them this question. How come they moved out of your place? Oh, they moved out of my place because they had a kid and they needed a bigger place. Logical reason to move, right? Or, hey, they wanted to move to a new city. They wanted to move to a new school district, like logical reasons on why people move. So always want to call the landlord that was 2 before so you don't get the current landlord who probably wants to get them out of there if they're sketchy. And then the other thing you want to do is, at least with me, you want to not make them jump through hoops, but you want to make sure that they comply with your process of renting properties. And my process is very simple. They go, they see the listing online, they fill out a brief survey on Google that just says their name, their information, their email, where do they work, how much do they make, can they provide pay stubs, what's their credit score, like just basic information. This Google form takes like 2 minutes to fill out. If they can't fill something like that out, or they object to something like that, probably going to be a pain in the butt tenant, right? If they comply with that and they fill that out with no issue and they have no problem telling me basic information that I should know as a landlord, I'll let them take the next step, which in that case is a picture of their driver's license. I'll let them go see the property. If they like the property, then they fill out a formal application. They pay a small application fee so I can run their credit. And assuming their credit and their income lines up with what they told me and they seem like a decent person, I'll probably rent to them. I'm not too picky. So that's how I screen tenants. I would say I have about an 85% success rate with this. You're never going to get 100% with tenants. You're always going to have some bad apples. But as a landlord, the takeaway you want to have is do your homework up front and make sure you dive under every nook and cranny before you allow someone to live in your property. Because I'll tell you what, there's nothing worse as a landlord than having a bad tenant who doesn't respect you or your property and having to do an eviction. It's a lose-lose situation for everybody. The tenant loses because they have to leave the property. The landlord loses because they have to pay for an eviction and deal with all that drama. And in New York, you got to get a lawyer involved. So it's just expensive. It's stressful. They could trash your property. Lord knows that's happened to me multiple times. And, it is what it is. It's part of the game. But if you follow those steps, you'll most likely have decent tenants in your property. And here's the last thing I'll add to this. You're never going to find the perfect tenant, right? You have to be willing to budge a little bit and hear people out. Like I remember, good example, I gave somebody the opportunity to live in one of my homes, but originally the credit was a problem, right? The credit was a problem. They actually didn't have any credit. And I was a little leery of that. But after speaking to them and to the agent who I had help me list this thing, I said, you know what? They seem like great people. I want to give them a chance. And they lived in the home for a year and they were great. They were fantastic tenants. They wanted to move because they wanted to live closer to their job, but then they referred me the current tenant who's in there who's fantastic as well. So you got to make exceptions. You got to give people a chance, but at the same time, you got to do your due diligence as well. You got to have your gut make that decision a lot of the times if it's on the fence. So hopefully these tips were helpful. In summary, number one, you want to look for their income to be 3 times the rent. Number two, you want to check their credit and investigate that. The third thing is you want to call the landlord that they had before the current landlord and see what the deal is with them. And then another thing you could do too, I'll just throw this in as a bonus if you're still watching, check them out on social media. Take a look at these people. Pretty much 3 out of 4 people nowadays have a Facebook profile. So look at them on social media, see what they're up to. Are they up to good stuff or bad stuff, right? That'll tell you a lot about somebody. Like I think that's a great thing. Last but not least, I got to make sure, I got to throw this disclaimer in there. I'm not an attorney. I'm not a real estate broker. I'm not a licensed property manager. I'm not a CPA. I'm just an independent real estate investor with no licenses. So this is not supposed to be real estate brokerage advice. This is not property management advice. So consult with an attorney, a property manager, a broker before you do any of this, and don't violate fair housing, right? Follow the laws. Every state, every county can be different. So just take this as a guideline, and I hope you got value from it. And if you did, subscribe, like the video. And if you're in the Hudson Valley, Delaware, Seattle, Reno, or San Diego, and you got a house you want to wholesale to me, or just do a deal JV with me, send me an email, greg@velocityhousebuyers.com. Take care.